November 23, 1944. The Hürtgen Forest, along the German-Belgian border. Rain mixed with sleet hammered against reinforced concrete, creating a rhythm that 17 men had been listening to for 6 consecutive days. Inside Bunker 437, part of the Siegfried Line's network of fortifications, the air smelled of wet wool, gun oil, and the particular mustiness that comes from too many bodies confined in too little space. The temperature hovered just above freezing. Condensation ran down the gray walls in steady streams, collecting in puddles on the floor that no amount of mopping could eliminate. Private First Class Heinrich Weber sat on his bunk with his back against the cold concrete, watching the single electric bulb that provided the bunker's only illumination. 22 years old, from a village outside Stuttgart, Weber had been an art student before the war. His hands, which once held brushes with confident precision, now trembled slightly as they held a tin cup of ersatz coffee made from burnt acorns. The trembling wasn't from cold, though the bunker was bitterly cold. It was from something else. Something that had no name but was spreading through the bunker like an infection. The 17 men of Bunker 437 were supposed to be holding a critical section of the west wall. Their assignment was straightforward. Man the observation posts. Report American movements. Maintain the defensive position. Wait for orders. But orders had stopped coming 3 days ago. Radio contact with command had become sporadic, then ceased entirely. The field telephone line, which connected their bunker to the regimental headquarters 5 kilometers to the rear, had gone dead during an artillery barrage on the second day. They were alone. Cut off. And none of them spoke about what that meant. The bunker itself was a masterpiece of defensive engineering. Walls 3 meters thick. A self-contained ventilation system. Storage for ammunition and supplies meant to sustain a garrison for weeks. The Wehrmacht had built it in 1938, during the first flush of confidence after the occupation of the Rhineland. The concrete was German concrete, the steel was Krupp steel, and the design had been approved by engineers who believed that Germany would hold these fortifications for 1,000 years. Now, in November 1944, those 1,000 years had condensed into an uncertain present that stretched forward no further than the next hour, the next artillery barrage, the next American patrol that might appear without warning in the woods beyond the firing slits. Sergeant Emil Richter, the bunker's commander, was 41 years old. Too old for frontline duty under normal circumstances, but these were not normal circumstances. He had survived the Russian front, been wounded twice, and received orders to train new recruits at a depot in Bavaria. Instead, he found himself in the Hürtgen Forest, responsible for 16 men who were discovering that defensive fortifications could become prisons as easily as they could become shelters. Richter understood what was happening to his men. He had seen it before in Russia, in the terrible winter of 1942, in bunkers and dugouts where men waited for death that came slowly or suddenly but always seemed inevitable. The symptoms were predictable. First came the silence. Men stopped talking except when necessary. Then came the staring. Eyes that focused on nothing, that seemed to look inward at something private and hopeless. Then came the deterioration of discipline, of hygiene, of the small rituals that separated soldiers from animals. The bunker had 2 observation posts. One faced west toward American lines. One faced south toward a forest road that theoretically represented a supply route but had seen no traffic for days. Men rotated through 2-hour shifts, watching sectors of wilderness where nothing ever moved except rain and the occasional deer that had somehow survived the artillery. Between shifts, they slept or tried to sleep. They ate canned meat and hard bread from diminishing supplies. They played cards with decks that had become so worn the suits were difficult to distinguish. They smoked cigarettes until the cigarettes ran out, then smoked pipe tobacco, then nothing. And they thought about things they tried not to think about. Private Joseph Brunner, 19 years old, from a farm in Bavaria, had received a letter from his mother 3 weeks earlier. It had caught up with him just before his unit moved into the West Wall. His father had died of a heart attack while harvesting potatoes. His 2 younger brothers, both of military age, had been conscripted. His mother was alone on the farm with his 12-year-old sister. The letter asked no questions and made no demands. It simply stated facts. But Brunner had been reading it every night by candlelight, trying to find some meaning in the careful handwriting, trying to understand what his mother wanted him to know or do or feel. Corporal Hans Dietrich, 24, had been a schoolteacher in Cologne. He had joined the Wehrmacht in 1942, believing the propaganda about defending European civilization against Bolshevism. The belief had lasted until Kursk, where he had seen civilization reduced to mud and blood and burning metal. He rarely spoke now. When he did speak, his voice carried a flatness that made other men uncomfortable. He had stopped reading the books he carried in his pack. Instead, he stared at the concrete walls with an expression that suggested he was calculating something complex and finding the answer unsatisfying. The youngest soldier in the bunker was Private Karl Stein, 17 years old, conscripted from a Hitler Youth unit just 4 months earlier. He had arrived at the bunker believing he was defending the fatherland. Now he believed nothing except that he wanted to go home and that going home was impossible. He cried at night, quietly, with his face turned to the wall, thinking no one could hear him. Everyone could hear him. No one acknowledged it. Acknowledging it would require acknowledging what they all felt. This was the problem that Heinrich Weber observed from his bunk on November 23, 1944. Not the Americans. Not the cold or the isolation or the dwindling supplies. The problem was despair, and despair was killing his comrades more surely than enemy artillery. He could see it in their faces. In the way they moved. In the silence that had replaced conversation. They were becoming ghosts before they died. They were losing the will to remain human. Weber had been an art student at the Stuttgart Academy before the war. He had studied with teachers who believed art was humanity's highest achievement, that beauty had purpose beyond decoration, that creating something was an act of defiance against chaos and meaninglessness. Those beliefs seemed absurd now, childish abstractions that had no place in a concrete bunker where 17 men waited for death or capture or madness. But on November 23, 1944, watching Sergeant Richter stare at a wall map that showed positions no one had updated in 3 days, watching young Karl Stein press his face against cold concrete as if the stone could offer comfort, watching Corporal Dietrich methodically clean a rifle that was already perfectly clean simply to have something to do with his hands, Weber made a decision. He had half a pencil in his pocket. Barely 2 inches long, worn down from writing letters that would never be mailed. He had no paint, no brushes, no proper materials. What he had was concrete walls, dim electric light, and the certain knowledge that if something didn't change in this bunker, the men inside it would disintegrate from within long before the Americans ever arrived. That evening, while the others slept or pretended to sleep, Weber approached the largest section of blank wall in the bunker's main chamber. He studied the concrete in the weak light. Smooth in some places, rough in others, marked by the wooden forms that had shaped it 6 years earlier. Then he began to draw. He started with a single line. Nothing elaborate. Just a horizon, sketched with the stub of pencil, marking the boundary between earth and sky. It was barely visible in the dim light, just a shadow on gray concrete. But it was something where nothing had been before. It was a beginning. The first man to notice what Weber was doing was Corporal Dietrich. He had been lying on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, when he heard the faint scratching sound of pencil on concrete. He turned his head slowly, watching Weber's back as the young soldier worked at the wall with methodical concentration. "What are you doing?" Dietrich's voice carried no particular emotion. It was simply a question. Weber didn't turn around. "Drawing," he said. "What does it look like?" "It looks like you're scratching on a wall with a pencil stub." "Then I'm drawing with a pencil stub." Dietrich considered this for a moment. Then he stood, crossed the small distance to the wall, and studied what Weber had created. The horizon line had been joined by others. Rough outlines of hills. The suggestion of trees. Nothing detailed. Nothing realistic. Just shapes that implied landscape, that suggested a world beyond concrete walls. "Why?" Dietrich asked. Weber continued working. "Because looking at blank walls is making everyone crazy. Including me. Especially me. And you think drawing pictures will help? I think it won't make things worse." Dietrich returned to his bunk without further comment. But 15 minutes later, Weber heard him speak again. "My village is in the Rhine Valley. There's a hill behind the church. In autumn, you can see for 30 kilometers. Vineyards and river and towns. You should put a river in your picture." Weber paused. Then he nodded. "All right. A river." He didn't have the materials to create a river. Not properly. But he had the pencil, and he had observed water carefully during his years as an art student. Movement, reflection, the way light interacted with flowing surfaces. He roughed in a river valley, using the side of the pencil to create shadows that suggested depth and distance. By morning, 3 other men had noticed the work. They said nothing, but Weber felt their attention. That afternoon, during his observation post-shift, he thought about what he wanted to create. Not just a landscape. Something more. Something that would give the men in this bunker something to look at beyond concrete and darkness. When his shift ended, he returned to the wall. He had been thinking about the technical challenges. A pencil on concrete produced faint, difficult lines. The surface was rough in places, smooth in others, making consistent shading nearly impossible. The light was terrible, a single bulb that cast harsh shadows and left corners in darkness. These weren't ideal conditions for creating art. But ideal conditions were a luxury from another life. Weber worked with what he had. Over the next 3 days, the landscape on the wall grew more complex. Weber worked whenever he wasn't on shift or sleeping. He used the pencil stub until it became too small to hold, then he began experimenting with other materials. Charcoal from the small heating stove. The black powder residue from rifle cleaning. A piece of red brick he found in the debris outside the bunker entrance. Ash mixed with water from the condensation puddles. None of these were proper art supplies. All of them could mark concrete. The landscape that emerged was unlike anything Weber had attempted before. It wasn't realistic. It couldn't be, not with these crude materials. Instead, it became something more elemental. Hills rising in rough, powerful lines. Sky suggested by areas left untouched, the concrete's natural gray becoming clouds and distance. Trees implied by vertical strokes, forests indicated by darker areas where Weber had used the charcoal heavily. And through the center of the composition, the river. He gave it particular attention, working and reworking the suggestion of flow and current until the concrete wall seemed to hold actual water, caught in a moment of perpetual movement. Other men began contributing materials. Private Brunner found a rusted nail that, scraped across concrete, left reddish-brown marks. Weber used it to add warmth to the earth tones. Sergeant Richter, watching Weber work one evening, wordlessly handed him a half-stick of blue chalk that he had been carrying in his pocket for no particular reason. Weber stared at it for a moment as if it were a treasure, then carefully added blue to the river, to the distant sky, creating color where everything had been monochrome gray. Something changed in the bunker during those days. Not obviously. Not dramatically. But the quality of the silence shifted from hopeless to attentive. Men began spending time near the wall, studying what Weber was creating, sometimes offering quiet suggestions. "Make the sky bigger," said Private Stein, the 17-year-old who cried at night. "More open." Weber expanded the sky. "There should be a bird," said another soldier whose name was Friedrich, 23, from Hamburg. "Just one. Flying." Weber added a bird, a simple V-shape in the distance, but positioned carefully so it suggested both freedom and loneliness. The work became a focal point. Men on observation duty would return and check the wall's progress. They began taking positions near it during their off hours, sitting with their backs to the concrete, facing the crude landscape instead of the bunker's interior darkness. They started talking again. Not much. Not about anything important. But the suffocating silence had broken. Corporal Dietrich, who had first questioned the purpose of Weber's work, began describing the Rhine Valley in detail. The way autumn fog settled in the hollows. How vineyards looked after harvest. The specific shade of green that appeared in spring. Weber listened carefully and incorporated these descriptions, adding texture and depth to the landscape through Dietrich's memories. Private Brunner talked about his family's farm. The shape of the barn. The apple orchard his grandfather had planted. The way morning light hit the valley where his village sat. Weber added elements that echoed these descriptions, creating a composite landscape that belonged to no specific place but somehow represented all the places these men remembered. The mural grew to cover the entire western wall of the bunker's main chamber. 10 meters long, 3 meters high, filling the space that had been blank concrete with something alive. Weber worked systematically, dividing the wall into sections, developing each area while maintaining overall composition. He had learned formal techniques at the Stuttgart Academy. He applied them now with materials that would have horrified his instructors. Sergeant Richter watched the transformation with quiet approval. He understood what was happening, even if he couldn't articulate it precisely. The men needed something to hope for. They needed proof that humanity could create as well as destroy. They needed to believe that beauty had not been permanently eliminated from the world by artillery and machine guns and the slow grinding machinery of total war. The mural provided that proof. Crude, improvised, created under terrible conditions with inappropriate materials, it nonetheless demonstrated that creation was possible. That somewhere beyond these concrete walls, the world still existed. Rivers still flowed. Sky still opened. Hills still rose against horizons. On November 28, 5 days after Weber had drawn his first horizon line, something remarkable happened. Private Stein, the 17-year-old, asked Weber for the chalk. Weber handed it over, wondering what the boy wanted with it. Stein approached a small section of wall near the bunker's entrance, a space Weber hadn't reached yet. He stood there for several minutes, just looking at the gray concrete. Then he drew a house. It wasn't a good house. The proportions were wrong, the perspective was impossible, and the details were childish. But it was recognizably a house. With a door and windows and a roof. A house that could be home. Stein stepped back, looking at what he had created. Then he turned to Weber, his face showing expression for the first time in days. "My house," he said simply. "In Augsburg." Weber nodded. "It's good. Leave it there." Others began adding their own elements to the mural. Not everyone. Some men still refused to participate, maintaining their positions on bunks, maintaining their silence. But enough participated to make the wall a collective work. A farm building appeared near the horizon. A church steeple. A bridge. Elements from different memories, different lives, combining into a landscape that represented not any single place but the idea of place itself. The concept of home. The technical challenges of working on concrete with improvised materials forced Weber to develop new techniques. He learned to use the wall's natural texture to create effects impossible with traditional materials. Rough areas became rocky outcroppings. Smooth sections became water or sky. The limited color palette, instead of restricting the work, gave it a haunting quality, as if the landscape existed in some other dimension where conventional color had not yet been invented. Weber worked primarily in the evening hours, after his observation shifts, when most men were trying to sleep. The bunker was quietest then, and the single electric bulb created dramatic shadows that helped him judge depth and form. He would stand before the wall for long periods, studying what he had created, planning the next addition, the next development. His back ached from standing. His eyes burned from the bad light. His hands were stained black and red and blue from the various materials he used. He didn't care. Creating the mural gave him purpose. It gave all of them purpose. They were no longer simply waiting for death or capture or relief that might never come. They were maintaining civilization, keeping faith with beauty, proving that even in this concrete tomb surrounded by war, human beings could still create something that elevated rather than destroyed. The Americans didn't come. The radio remained dead. The telephone line stayed silent. Supplies continued to dwindle. But the mural grew, filling the wall with improvised beauty that transformed the bunker from prison into sanctuary. December 1st, 1944. The 9th day. The first artillery shell hit at dawn. The bunker shook, dust falling from the ceiling in fine streams. The men, mostly asleep, jerked awake with the automatic response of soldiers who had learned that consciousness equals survival. The second shell hit closer. Then the third. The barrage lasted 20 minutes. The bunker's thick walls held, as they had been designed to hold, but the sound was overwhelming. Each impact transmitted through concrete and earth as a physical shock that could be felt in bone marrow, in teeth, in the hollow spaces of the skull. The single electric bulb flickered, died, came back, died again, finally giving out completely. Darkness. Absolute. The kind that makes eyes create phantom shapes, that makes space lose all dimension. When the shelling stopped, Sergeant Richter called for a damage report. The bunker itself was intact, but the communication trenches connecting them to adjacent positions had collapsed. The entrance tunnel showed signs of structural stress. Cracks had appeared in the ceiling where none had been visible before. And the ventilation system, which had been marginal at best, now moved air with a labored wheeze that suggested blocked passages and compromised filters. Private Brunner, who had been on observation post duty when the barrage started, reported movement in the American lines. Infantry advancing through the forest. Armored vehicles on the forest road. The attack that everyone had known was coming had finally arrived. Richter made his decision quickly. They would hold the bunker as long as possible, then surrender if the position became untenable. There would be no heroic last stand, no pointless sacrifice. These men had already given enough to a cause that was clearly lost. He didn't speak these thoughts aloud, but they were understood. Everyone in the bunker knew the war was over. The only question was whether they would survive to see the peace. The electric power didn't return. Weber found candles in the emergency supply locker, lit them, distributed them throughout the bunker. The flickering yellow light transformed the space. Shadows danced on walls. The mural, which had been somber and contemplative under electric illumination, became something else in candlelight. The rough brushstrokes and improvised materials that had seemed crude in harsh light now appeared deliberate, intentional. The landscape Weber had created seemed to move in the unstable illumination, seemed almost alive. The men prepared for attack. They checked weapons, distributed ammunition, took positions at firing ports. The routine was familiar. They had trained for this scenario dozens of times. Load the machine gun. Stack ammunition cans within reach. Clear firing lanes. Coordinate fields of fire. The mechanical actions provided comfort, a familiar structure when everything else had become uncertain. But between the preparations, between the mechanical tasks of soldiering, the men kept looking at the wall. At the landscape that represented everything they were defending and everything they had lost. The river that would still flow whether they lived or died. The sky that would still open over hills that neither knew nor cared about human conflicts. Corporal Dietrich, standing at his firing port, watching American soldiers advance through trees 400 meters distant, spoke without turning around. The river should have a bend in it. Rivers never run straight for long. They curve. They find their own way. Weber, crouched near the ammunition supply, preparing magazines for the machine gun, paused. "You want me to fix the river?" "No. Just saying. Rivers bend. I'll keep that in mind if we survive the next hour." The attack, when it came, was methodical rather than desperate. The Americans had overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower. They had no reason to take risks. They advanced by sections, using terrain for cover, calling in artillery on identified strongpoints. Professional. Efficient. The kind of assault that couldn't be stopped by 17 men in a concrete bunker armed with 2 machine guns and rifles. Bunker 437 was bypassed. The Americans identified it, noted its position, and simply moved around it, cutting off any possibility of retreat or reinforcement. They had learned, at terrible cost, that direct assault on fortified positions was wasteful. Better to isolate strongpoints, cut them off, and force surrender through siege rather than storm. By late afternoon, the bunker was surrounded. No one had fired a shot. The Americans hadn't attacked, and Sergeant Richter had forbidden his men from firing unless directly engaged. Ammunition was limited. Every round might be needed later. And opening fire would only invite the kind of response that would leave the bunker a smoking crater. The siege had begun. The Americans established positions in the woods around the bunker, close enough to prevent any escape attempt, far enough to avoid easy rifle shots. They didn't waste artillery on the structure. They simply waited. Time and isolation would accomplish what explosive couldn't. Inside the bunker, the quality of waiting changed. Before, they had been waiting for relief that might never come. Now they were waiting for an ending that was certain. The only question was what form that ending would take. Surrender, most likely. Richter had already decided. When supplies ran out, when further resistance became meaningless, they would surrender. Better to become prisoners than corpses. But supplies wouldn't run out immediately. They had food for another week. Water was limited but adequate. Ammunition was plentiful. They could hold for days if necessary. Days of waiting in darkness, listening to American voices in the forest outside, knowing that every hour brought them closer to an ending they couldn't control. The confinement became oppressive in a way it hadn't been before. Previously, the isolation had been abstract. Now it was concrete. Real. Physical. American soldiers stood 20 meters from the bunker entrance. Escape was impossible. Relief was impossible. They were trapped in a concrete box beneath German earth while the war moved past them. The mural became even more important during these days. In the candlelight, with American voices occasionally audible through the ventilation shafts, the men gathered near the wall. They didn't speak about surrender or captivity or what might happen next. Instead, they talked about the landscape Weber had created. About rivers and hills and sky. About the places they remembered, the homes they might never see again. Private Stein added another house to his section of the wall. This one was better proportioned than the first. He worked carefully, using the precious chalk to create details. Windows with shutters. A garden. A path leading to the door. When he finished, he sat back and stared at it for a long time. "That's my grandmother's house," he said to no one in particular. "She bakes bread every Sunday. The whole village can smell it." Weber, working on another section of the mural, adding details to the river valley, spoke without turning around. "What kind of bread?" "Dark bread. Rye. With caraway seeds. My mother made bread like that," said Corporal Dietrich. "Before the war. When there was still flour and butter and time to bake." The conversation continued quietly, men sharing memories of food, of home, of small domestic details that had seemed insignificant until war made them precious. The mural provided permission for these conversations. It made memory safe. It allowed men to speak about what they had lost without drowning in despair. On December 3rd, the Americans called for surrender. A voice, speaking German with an American accent, amplified through some kind of megaphone, echoed across the frozen ground. The message was simple. The bunker was surrounded. Resistance was futile. Surrender would be accepted. Terms would be honorable. They had 1 hour to decide. Sergeant Richter called his men together. No one argued. No one suggested continued resistance. They were tired. They were isolated. They had done their duty, held their position, maintained discipline under terrible circumstances. Now it was time to accept reality. But before they surrendered, before they climbed out of the concrete bunker into American captivity, Weber asked for 1 more hour. Not to prepare for surrender. Not to destroy equipment or burn documents. He asked for time to finish the mural. Richter, understanding without explanation, agreed. He would tell the Americans they needed time to prepare for surrender. It wasn't untrue. Preparation took many forms. Weber worked quickly. He had been planning this final edition for days, knowing somehow that time was running out, that the mural would need completion before whatever came next arrived. Using the last of the blue chalk, the charcoal, the brick dust, the improvised materials that had become his palette, he added one last element to the landscape. Light. A suggestion of sunrise or sunset, impossible to distinguish which, breaking through clouds on the horizon. Not realistic. Not technically precise. Just an impression of light meeting dark, of transition, of change. He worked it into the sky above the river valley, creating the sense that whatever was happening in this landscape, whatever time of day or night it represented, change was coming. The world was moving forward. When he finished, he stepped back and studied the completed work. 10 meters of concrete transformed into landscape. Crude in technique, limited in color, created with materials no proper artist would touch. And somehow, despite all its technical flaws, beautiful. Not because it was perfect, but because it was human. Because it represented choice and effort and the refusal to surrender completely to circumstances. The 17 men of Bunker 437 stood together, looking at what they had created. The landscape that belonged to nowhere and everywhere. The river that would never stop flowing. The sky that would never stop opening. The light that suggested morning or evening or both or neither. Then they prepared to surrender. The climb from the bunker into December afternoon light was disorienting. After days in artificial illumination, the open sky seemed impossibly vast. The cold air bit through uniforms that had become rank with sweat and confined space. American soldiers, younger than expected, watched the 17 Germans emerge with weapons that remained carefully lowered but ready. The surrender itself was anticlimactic. Hands raised. Weapons set carefully on frozen ground. A few brief words in broken German from an American officer who looked barely old enough to shave. Then the systematic search, the confiscation of personal items, the rough reorganization from soldiers into prisoners. Weber had hidden the stub of pencil and the remaining piece of blue chalk in his boot. The American soldier who searched him was thorough but not cruel. He found the chalk, looked at it, looked at Weber's hands which were still stained with brick dust and charcoal, and handed it back without comment. A small mercy in a day of surrenders. They were marched to a temporary holding area, a clearing in the forest where other prisoners sat under guard, waiting for transport to whatever came next. POW camps in France, probably. Maybe England. Definitely away from the front, away from Germany, away from everything familiar. That night, sleeping under tarpaulins in the freezing rain, Weber thought about the mural they had left behind in the bunker. 17 men had surrendered. Their war was over. But the landscape on the concrete wall remained. The river still flowed in charcoal and chalk. The sky still opened above hills drawn with brick dust. The light still broke through clouds that existed only as negative space, as the gray of concrete left unmarked. He wondered how long the mural would last. Would other soldiers find it when they occupied the bunker? Would they recognize it as art, or simply as graffiti on a wall? Would they cover it with their own marks, their own messages, their own attempts to leave some trace of human presence in the concrete wilderness? Or would it simply fade, gradually, erased by time and moisture and the indifference of abandoned fortifications? The prisoners were processed through a series of temporary facilities, each one slightly more organized than the last. Forms were filled out. Names were recorded. Personal histories were documented in the mechanical bureaucracy that transformed individuals into files, into numbers, into administrative problems to be solved by distant headquarters staff. The other prisoners came from various units. Some had surrendered like Weber's group, recognizing reality and accepting captivity as preferable to death. Others had been captured in combat, wounded or overwhelmed or simply unlucky. They shared the particular exhaustion of defeated soldiers, the psychological weight that comes from knowing you failed to achieve the objective for which you had sacrificed so much. In the POW camps that followed, Weber discovered a strange phenomenon. Men who had nothing would nevertheless attempt to create something. Drawings scratched into wooden bunks with nails. Sculptures formed from bread dough and smuggled wire. Songs composed in the darkness of crowded barracks where hundreds of men tried to sleep without privacy or comfort or hope of release until the war ended. Creation became resistance. Not military resistance. Not escape attempts or sabotage or any of the dramatic acts that prison camp stories usually featured. Instead, it was the quiet resistance of maintaining humanity in circumstances designed to reduce men to animals. The insistence that human beings could create as well as destroy, could make beauty as well as war, could choose meaning even when choice seemed eliminated. Weber found materials. A piece of charcoal from the camp stove. Scraps of paper salvaged from administrative offices. The gray concrete walls of barracks that reminded him, painfully, of the bunker where he had created his first real work. He began drawing again. Small pieces at first. Portraits of other prisoners. Landscapes remembered from childhood. Simple sketches that circulated through the camp, passed from hand to hand, treasured as proof that something beyond survival still mattered. Word spread that there was an artist in Block 7. Men came to him with requests. Draw my wife. Draw my children. Draw my house. Draw the village where I grew up. Draw something that proves the world still exists beyond these fences and guard towers. Weber drew. Not because he believed these drawings would change anything. Not because he thought art could end the war or free prisoners or heal wounds that went deeper than flesh. He drew because men asked him to, and because refusing would have been one more surrender, one more concession to the forces that wanted to reduce them all to numbers and rations and problems to be solved. The winter of 1944-45 was brutal in the prisoner of war camps. Food was inadequate. Heat was minimal. Disease spread through crowded barracks where men slept pressed against each other for warmth. Some died. Some went mad. Some simply stopped, their bodies continuing while something essential inside them gave up. But in Block 7, on the walls of a barracks building that held 200 German prisoners, a mural began to appear. Weber worked on it during whatever free time he could find, using whatever materials he could scavenge or trade for. Other prisoners contributed. A man who had been a carpenter before the war helped with composition and perspective. Another who had studied chemistry showed Weber how to mix compounds that produced different colors from the limited materials available. The mural grew slowly. It wasn't the landscape from the bunker. This was something different. A city. Specifically, a German city, though which one was deliberately ambiguous. Buildings that could be Berlin or Munich or Dresden or Hamburg. Streets that represented every street. A marketplace. A church. Houses with gardens. Ordinary life, recreated on prison walls as an act of memory and defiance. The American guards noticed. Some were suspicious. They examined the mural carefully, looking for hidden messages, for escape plans, for anything that might represent threat or conspiracy. They found only architecture and memory. Art without politics. Beauty without message beyond a simple insistence that beauty could exist even here. One guard, a young man from Iowa who had studied art before the war, brought Weber paint. Real paint. Oil paint in small tubes that had been sent from home in a care package, meant for the guard's own sketching but given instead to a prisoner because, as he explained in halting German, art matters more than sides. And you can do more with this than I ever could. The gift transformed the mural. Color appeared where everything had been shades of gray and brown. Blue sky. Green trees. Red roofs. The city on the prison wall became alive in a way that charcoal and dust could never achieve. Men would stand before it during the brief evening hours before lights out, studying the details, remembering the places they came from, the lives they had lived before uniforms and orders and the machinery of war had absorbed everything else. Private Stein was in the same camp, assigned to a different block but occasionally able to visit. He had not recovered from the surrender. Something in him had broken during those final days in the bunker, and captivity had not repaired it. He was thin to the point of skeletal. He rarely spoke. When he did speak, his words came slowly, carefully, as if he was translating from some other language. But he came to see the mural. He stood before it for long minutes, not speaking, just looking. Then he turned to Weber. "The bunker," he said. "Is it still there?" "Probably. Concrete lasts." "And the painting? The river and the sky?" "I don't know. Maybe." Stein nodded slowly. "I think about it. That wall. The river that never stopped flowing even when everything else stopped. Do you think anyone will see it? After the war, I mean. Do you think anyone will know we were there?" Weber had no answer. He understood what Stein was really asking. Do we matter? Did our suffering have meaning? Will anyone remember that we existed, that we tried to remain human in circumstances that destroyed humanity? These were questions without answers. Weber knew this. But he also knew that creating the mural in the bunker had mattered to the 17 men who had lived there. Creating the mural in the prison camp mattered to the 200 men who saw it every day. The meaning was in the act itself, in the choice to create rather than simply endure. Whether anyone else ever saw or remembered or cared was beyond their control. The war moved toward its end with the terrible inevitability of a natural disaster. News filtered into the camps through various channels. Rumors. Occasional newspapers. Conversations with guards who were less careful than they should have been. Germany was collapsing. Cities were burning. The eastern and western fronts were contracting, squeezing what remained of the Wehrmacht into an ever-shrinking area where surrender was not a question of if but when. In the prison camp, the knowledge brought no joy. These men were German. They had fought for Germany. The nation's defeat was their defeat, regardless of whether they had believed in the cause or simply followed orders or never questioned what they were doing until it was too late to question anything. Weber continued working on the mural. As news grew worse, as the dimensions of Germany's catastrophe became clear, he worked with greater intensity. The city on the wall became more detailed. More complete. More alive. He added people to the streets. Small figures, barely suggested, but recognizably human. Living ordinary lives in an ordinary city on an ordinary day before war had arrived to transform ordinary into nightmare. Corporal Dietrich, who was also in the camp, spent long hours near the mural. He had aged visibly during the months of captivity. His face had become angular, all flesh worn away by inadequate food and the strain of survival. But he still spoke about the Rhine Valley, about vineyards and villages and the way autumn light fell across landscapes that might never exist again in the form he remembered. You should add a vineyard, he told Weber. On the hillside above the city. Weber added a vineyard. Careful rows of vines, suggested rather than detailed, rising up a slope that faced south toward imaginary sun. That's good, Dietrich said. That's how they looked. How they should look again. Someday. May 7, 1945. The war in Europe ended. The news reached the prison camp through official channels. A brief announcement from the American commandant, standing before assembled prisoners, reading from a prepared statement. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Hostilities had ceased. The prisoners would remain in custody until arrangements could be made for their repatriation or processing. But the war was over. The killing had stopped. The reaction in the camp was complicated. Relief that death had become less immediate. Anxiety about what came next. Grief for the Germany that had been destroyed. Shame for the things that had been done in Germany's name. All of these emotions, tangled together, too complex to sort into anything resembling simple response. Weber heard the announcement while working on a final section of the mural. He had been adding details to the city's marketplace, trying to capture the particular quality of light that he remembered from Stuttgart's morning markets before the war. His hand stopped. The brush, loaded with paint that he had carefully mixed from the limited colors available, hung in the air. He stood motionless for several seconds. Then he continued painting. The war was over. But the mural was not finished. Over the following days, the camp's population changed. Some prisoners were released quickly, particularly those from western regions now under Allied occupation. Others remained, their futures uncertain. Weber continued working on the mural, racing against time, knowing that his moment in this place would end soon but wanting to complete what he had started. On May 15, a group of American officers toured the camp, conducting inspections and assessments. One of them, a captain who had been a museum director in civilian life, noticed the mural in Block 7. He stopped, studied it carefully, asked questions about who had created it and how and why. Weber was brought forward. The captain, speaking surprisingly good German, asked him about his training, his background, his reasons for creating art in a prison camp. Weber answered simply. He was an art student before the war. He painted because men needed something to look at beyond fences and guard towers. The mural gave prisoners something to hope for, even when hope seemed impossible. The captain listened carefully. Then he asked a question that surprised Weber. Would you be willing to document what you saw? The bunker where you created your first mural. The experience of soldiers trapped in fortifications. The human cost of defensive warfare. Document how? Through art. Drawings. Paintings. Whatever medium you prefer. We're establishing a historical art program. Documenting the war through visual records created by participants. You have a perspective that professional war artists can't replicate. You were there. You lived it. Your work could help people understand what soldiers experienced. Weber considered this carefully. He thought about the bunker. About the men who had surrendered with him. About the mural they had left behind on concrete walls. About whether anyone would ever see that work or understand what it had meant to 17 men waiting for death or capture in the darkness. I would need to see the bunker again, he said finally. To remember it accurately. To understand what we created there and why it mattered. The captain nodded. That can be arranged. 3 weeks later, Weber found himself back in the Hürtgen Forest. American military transport had brought him to the general area. Then he walked, accompanied by 2 guards who had been instructed to let him move freely but ensure he didn't disappear into the forest. The landscape was devastated. Trees had been shredded by artillery. The ground was cratered and torn. Fortifications stood in various states of destruction, some intact, others reduced to concrete rubble. Finding Bunker 437 required careful navigation and half-remembered landmarks. When he finally located it, his heart sank. The entrance had partially collapsed. The observation posts had been destroyed by direct hits. The bunker itself showed damage that had not been present when they surrendered. Someone, probably American combat engineers, had attempted to demolish it with explosives. The attempt had failed to destroy the structure completely, but it had inflicted terrible wounds on the concrete that German engineers had believed would last 1,000 years. Weber climbed through the damaged entrance with difficulty. Inside, darkness. His guards provided flashlights. The beams cut through dust and darkness, revealing the interior of the bunker where he had spent those terrible days in November and December. The mural was still there. Water damage had affected sections. Concrete had spalled away in places, taking portions of the drawing with it. The explosion that had damaged the structure had created new cracks that ran through the landscape like wounds. But the essential composition remained. The river still flowed. The sky still opened. The hills still rose against the horizon. Weber stood before the wall, playing his flashlight slowly across the surface, seeing what he and the other prisoners had created 6 months earlier. It seemed impossible that it had survived. This crude artwork, created with improvised materials by desperate men, had outlasted the war itself. It remained when the men who created it had scattered to prison camps or graves or whatever uncertain futures awaited defeated soldiers. He thought about Sergeant Richter, who had approved the creation of the mural and understood instinctively why it mattered. About Corporal Dietrich, who had described the Rhine Valley in careful detail. About young Private Stein, who had drawn houses on the wall and talked about his grandmother's bread. About all 17 men who had contributed to this work, who had maintained humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. The American captain had given Weber a camera. Primitive equipment, but functional. He photographed the mural carefully, documenting what remained before weather and neglect completed what explosives had failed to accomplish. He worked slowly, methodically, ensuring that every section was recorded, that the complete work was preserved even if the physical original eventually disappeared. As he photographed, he noticed something he hadn't seen by flashlight alone. Other soldiers had been in the bunker after their surrender. Messages were scratched into walls. Names. Dates. The brief notations that soldiers everywhere leave when occupying temporary positions. But none of these later additions had touched the mural. The landscape remained unmarked except by weather and explosives. Some unspoken agreement among whoever had subsequently occupied this space had preserved what Weber and his comrades had created. He found this oddly moving. Unknown soldiers, probably American, probably young men who had their own stories and traumas and reasons for fighting, had chosen to leave this artwork undisturbed. Not because it was technically impressive. Not because they understood its history. Simply because it was human creation in the midst of destruction, and some instinct made them protect rather than deface it. Weber spent the entire afternoon in the bunker. He sketched sections of the mural from different angles. He photographed details. He made notes about the materials used, the techniques employed, the circumstances of creation. This documentation would become the foundation for larger works he would create later, attempting to capture not just the visual appearance of the mural but the emotional and psychological context that had made it meaningful. When he finally climbed back out of the bunker into late afternoon light, he felt something shift inside himself. The war had ended. Captivity would end. Eventually, he would return to civilian life, to whatever remained of Germany after total defeat. But this moment, standing beside the damaged bunker in the Hürtgen Forest, marking the transition between what had been and what would come next. The guards were patient, allowing him to sit on broken concrete, smoking a cigarette they had given him, looking out across the forest that had been a battlefield and was becoming wilderness again. Trees would grow back. The craters would fill with soil and leaves. New growth would cover the scars. Not immediately. Not completely. But gradually, nature would reclaim what war had devastated. The bunker would remain longer. Concrete resisted nature's healing more stubbornly than earth and wood. Decades from now, probably, hikers would still find these fortifications, would still climb into their dark interiors, would still wonder what had happened here and who had lived and died within these walls. Would they find the mural? Would they recognize it as art? Would they understand what it had meant to the men who created it? Weber hoped they would. But he also understood that meaning cannot be transmitted across time like historical facts. The mural existed in a context that was specific to November 1944, to 17 men facing despair and death, to the particular circumstances that made creation necessary for survival. Future visitors would see only a faded drawing on concrete walls. They would not feel what it had meant to watch that drawing emerge in the darkness, to contribute their own memories to its composition, to find hope in the act of creation when hope seemed impossible everywhere else. That evening, back in American custody but with his documentation complete, Weber began the first of what would become a series of drawings attempting to capture not just the visual appearance of the bunker and its mural, but the emotional reality of what had happened there. These drawings would be different from anything he had created before. More urgent. More necessary. More honest about war's capacity to destroy human dignity and humanity's capacity to resist that destruction through small acts of creation. The official disbanding of the prison camp came in stages throughout the summer of 1945. Prisoners were processed individually or in small groups, their futures determined by bureaucratic decisions made in distant offices by people who knew nothing about individual cases beyond what appeared in files and forms. Weber was among the fortunate ones. His art had attracted attention from American military authorities. The captain who had discovered his work in Block 7 had advocated for his release into a supervised program that employed former German soldiers in documentation and reconstruction work. It wasn't freedom, exactly. But it was employment, purpose, and the beginning of a path back to civilian life. Before leaving the camp, Weber attempted to preserve the mural in Block 7. He photographed it extensively, made careful sketches of sections that couldn't be properly captured in photographs, and documented the names of prisoners who had contributed to its creation. The American commandant gave him permission to work on this documentation for several days, recognizing that something historically significant existed on the prison walls. The barracks would be demolished when the camp closed. The mural would be destroyed. This was certain. But Weber wanted to ensure that some record survived, that future historians might know that even in captivity, even in defeat, men had created beauty and maintained humanity despite circumstances designed to eliminate both. Corporal Dietrich was released a week before Weber. Before leaving, he came to see the mural one final time. He stood before the city painted on prison walls, looking at the vineyard he had requested, remembering the Rhine Valley, the life he had lived before war had consumed everything. "I'm going home," Dietrich said quietly. "Or what's left of it. Cologne was mostly destroyed. I don't know if my family survived. I don't know if my house is still standing. I don't know anything except that I'm supposed to go back and find out." Weber nodded. This was the reality for all of them. They were being sent back to a Germany that no longer existed as they remembered it. Cities in ruins. Government collapsed. Economy destroyed. Millions dead. Everything they had known, everything they had fought for whether they believed in it or not, reduced to rubble and ash in desperate survival. "The mural," Dietrich continued, "this city we painted. It's not real. It never existed except on this wall. But it's more real than the Germany we're going back to, isn't it? Because this city represents what we wanted to remember. What we needed to believe still existed somewhere. Even if only in paint and memory." "It existed in memory," Weber said. "That's a kind of real." Private Stein was not among those released. He had deteriorated badly during the final months of captivity. Some combination of malnutrition, psychological trauma, and an infection that the camp doctors had been unable to properly treat had left him severely weakened. He was transferred to a military hospital, prognosis uncertain. Weber visited him before leaving the camp. Stein lay in a hospital bed, surrounded by other sick prisoners, looking like a ghost of the 17-year-old who had drawn houses on a bunker wall 6 months earlier. "I wanted to go home," Stein said, his voice barely above a whisper. "To see my grandmother. To smell the bread baking." "You will," Weber told him, knowing it was probably a lie but saying it anyway because sometimes lies are acts of kindness. "The painting in the bunker. You photographed it?" "Yes. It's documented. People will know it existed." "Good." Stein closed his eyes. "It mattered. Tell people it mattered." Weber promised he would. 3 weeks later, he received word that Stein had died of complications from his illness. 17 years old. One of millions of young men who had been consumed by a war they hadn't started and couldn't stop, whose lives had been reduced to brief entries in military records that would eventually be filed away and forgotten. But Stein had drawn houses on a bunker wall. He had contributed to a mural in a prison camp. He had insisted, through those small acts of creation, that he was more than a soldier, more than a prisoner, more than a casualty statistic. He had been human, and he had left marks that proved it. Weber incorporated these thoughts into the series of drawings he was creating for the American Historical Documentation Program. The work had become more complex than simple visual recording. He was attempting to capture something more difficult. The psychological reality of soldiers trapped in fortifications. The way despair could be temporarily held at bay through creative acts. The human cost of a war that had killed millions but also destroyed something less quantifiable. The belief that civilization and beauty and human dignity were permanent rather than fragile. He worked in a studio provided by the American military, a small room in a requisition building in Frankfurt where administrative functions were being established among the ruins. Other artists worked in adjacent rooms, all of them former soldiers or civilians employed in various documentation projects. They rarely spoke to each other. Each was wrestling with their own demons, their own attempts to process what they had experienced and witnessed. The series grew to encompass 30 drawings. Some depicted the bunker itself, attempting to show not just its physical structure but the psychological space it represented. Others focused on individual moments. Weber drawing the first horizon line. Men gathering near the wall to contribute their memories. The candlelight making the mural seem to move and breathe. The final night before surrender, standing together looking at what they had created. Weber also drew the prison camp mural, the city that had never existed except on prison walls. He drew prisoners standing before it, faces gaunt but expressions showing something beyond mere survival. He drew the young American guard who had given him paint. He drew the moment of the war's ending, how the news had arrived and how men had received it with complicated emotions that couldn't be reduced to simple relief or joy. And he drew Private Stein's house. The one Stein had drawn on the bunker wall. The one that represented home and family and a grandmother who baked bread on Sundays. He drew it carefully, precisely, as an act of memorial for a boy who would never go home. The American captain who had discovered Weber's work visited the studio regularly, reviewing the drawings as they developed. He asked questions about specific details, about the context of particular images, about what Weber was attempting to communicate through his art. These are different from typical war art, the captain observed during one visit. Most war artists focus on combat. On action and drama. Your work is about waiting. About the spaces between violence. About what men do when they're not fighting. That's what war actually is, Weber replied. For most soldiers, most of the time. Not combat. Just waiting. And trying to remain human during the waiting. The bunker mural. Why did you create it? Really? Weber paused, considering the question carefully. Because men were dying inside that bunker even though no one had shot them yet. Something was killing them. Despair, maybe. Or the certain knowledge that everything was lost. I thought if I could give them something to look at besides concrete walls, something that represented life continuing somewhere, it might help them survive a little longer. Did it work? We surrendered. We survived captivity. Most of us lived. I don't know if the mural made a difference or if we would have survived anyway. But I think it helped. I think it gave us something to hold on to when everything else was slipping away. The captain nodded slowly. These drawings will be important. Not immediately. People don't want to think about nuance and complexity right now. They want simple stories. Heroes and villains. Victory and defeat. But eventually, when the immediate emotions fade, people will want to understand what war actually felt like. What it did to the men who experienced it. Your work will help them understand. By winter of 1946, Weber had been released from American supervision and was attempting to rebuild his life as a civilian. He returned to Stuttgart, or what remained of it. The city had been devastated by Allied bombing. Entire districts reduced to rubble. The academy where he had studied art before the war no longer existed. The building stood, but it was a hollow shell, windows gone, roof collapsed, interior destroyed by fire and weather. Many former students had not survived the war. Those who had were scattered across occupied Germany, trying to piece together lives from the fragments that remained. The professors were mostly dead or too old to resume teaching. The curriculum that had seemed so important in 1939, the careful study of technique and composition and art history, felt irrelevant in a country where basic survival remained uncertain. But Weber was an artist. It was what he knew how to do. It was what he had done in the bunker and the prison camp. It was what he would continue doing because creating was the only response to destruction that made sense to him. He found work with an American Cultural Affairs office that was attempting to document the war's impact on German civilians. His role was to create visual records of daily life in occupied Germany. Bread lines. Rubble clearing. Displaced persons camps. The slow, grinding effort to rebuild not just buildings but society itself. The work paid enough to survive. But survival wasn't satisfying. Weber found himself returning constantly to the bunker drawings, to the prison camp memories, to the question of what art meant in the aftermath of total civilizational collapse. He attempted to locate the men who had been in Bunker 437 with him. Sergeant Richter had survived captivity and returned to his family near Hanover. Corporal Dietrich had found his house in Cologne mostly intact, his family alive. Others were harder to trace. Several had died in captivity. Some had been lost in the chaos of occupation and displacement. One or two had emigrated, leaving Germany entirely for new lives in Argentina or America. Those Weber managed to contact responded with varying degrees of interest to his questions about the bunker and the mural. Richter wrote back saying he thought about it occasionally, usually late at night when sleep was difficult. The memory had taken on an odd quality, he wrote. Sometimes it seemed like something that had happened to someone else. Other times it felt more real than the present moment. Dietrich's response was longer and more philosophical. The bunker had been a turning point, he wrote. Not in dramatic terms. Not a moment of revelation or transformation. But a place where he had learned something important about human resilience and the necessity of beauty even in terrible circumstances. The mural had given him hope when hope seemed unjustifiable. He was grateful for that gift, even though he hadn't understood at the time what Weber was doing or why it mattered. In 1948, Weber was commissioned to create a memorial piece for a local veterans organization. Not glorifying war. Not celebrating victory that hadn't existed for Germany. Instead, commemorating loss. Acknowledging sacrifice. Attempting to make sense of meaningless deaths and wasted lives and the complicated emotions of men who had served a cause that had been revealed as monstrous but had felt necessary at the time. He proposed recreating the bunker mural. Not as it had appeared on concrete walls in November 1944. But as a larger, more developed work that captured not just the visual elements but the emotional and psychological context of its creation. A painting that would show the landscape as it had been drawn on bunker walls, but also somehow convey the darkness of the space where it had been created, the desperation of the men who had drawn it, the hope it had represented when hope seemed impossible. The proposal was rejected. Too complicated. Too ambiguous. The veterans wanted something simpler. A traditional memorial. Names on stone. Perhaps a sculpture of a soldier. Nothing that required explanation or context or raised uncomfortable questions about what soldiers had experienced and felt. Weber understood. He withdrew the proposal and created what they wanted. A competent, conventional memorial that said nothing true about war but satisfied the need for public commemoration. He completed it professionally, got paid, and filed the experience away as one more compromise with reality. But privately, he continued working on the bunker mural project. He created a series of paintings attempting to capture something that couldn't really be captured. The way the landscape had appeared in candlelight. How it had felt to watch men contribute their memories to the composition. The strange comfort of drawing rivers and hills and sky while surrounded by concrete and darkness and the certainty of defeat. These paintings were exhibited in a small gallery in Stuttgart in 1950. The exhibition was not successful. Critics found the work depressing. The public, still recovering from war and occupation, didn't want to be reminded of bunkers and desperation and creative acts born from trauma. They wanted to move forward, to forget, to build new lives that bore no resemblance to what had been lost. The exhibition closed after 2 weeks. Weber returned the paintings to his small apartment, where they joined the growing collection of work that no one wanted to see. But something unexpected happened after the exhibition. A letter arrived from France. The writer identified himself as an American art historian who had been researching wartime art created by soldiers. He had heard about Weber's exhibition through contacts in the occupation administration. He was particularly interested in the bunker mural and wondered if Weber would be willing to discuss the project in detail. The correspondence that followed would last for years and eventually result in Weber's work being included in exhibitions on wartime art in America and Britain. The art historian, whose name was Robert Morrison, understood what Weber had been attempting to do. He recognized that the bunker mural represented something unique in the history of war art. Not propaganda. Not patriotic imagery. Not even traditional combat art. Instead, it was art created by soldiers for soldiers as a means of psychological survival. Morrison arranged for Weber to create a large-scale recreation of the bunker mural for an exhibition on wartime art scheduled to open in New York in 1953. The commission provided enough money for Weber to work full-time on the project for 6 months. More importantly, it gave him official recognition that his work had significance beyond personal memory or private grief. The recreation was different from the original. Larger. More developed. Executed with proper materials on prepared canvas rather than improvised substances on rough concrete. But Weber attempted to maintain the essential quality of the original. The rough immediacy. The sense of landscape emerging from darkness. The emotional resonance that had made the mural meaningful to men trapped in impossible circumstances. He included elements contributed by the other soldiers. Dietrich's vineyard on the hillside. Stein's houses. The suggestions and memories that had shaped the original composition. This wasn't just Weber's work. It was collaborative, even though most of the collaborators would never see the finished piece. When the painting was complete, Weber stood before it in his studio, studying what he had created. It was good. Technically accomplished. Emotionally powerful. It captured much of what he had wanted to express about that time in the bunker, about the men he had served with, about the necessity of beauty in circumstances that destroyed everything beautiful. But it wasn't the original. It couldn't be. The original had been specific to that moment, that place, those men. It had existed as crude marks on concrete walls lit by candlelight, created with materials that no proper artist would use, surrounded by the smell of gun oil and unwashed bodies and the constant threat of death or capture. This recreation was art. The original had been survival. Weber shipped the painting to New York, hoping it would communicate something essential to people who had never experienced war, never been trapped in bunkers, never faced the particular despair that comes from knowing your cause is lost and your life might be forfeit and the only choice left is how to face the end. The exhibition in New York opened in October 1953. Weber did not attend. Travel to America was still complicated for former German soldiers, and the cost of transatlantic passage was beyond his means. He received reports from Morrison describing the opening, the critical response, the public reaction to his recreation of the bunker mural. The response was mixed. Some critics praised the work as an important document of wartime psychology. Others found it too ambiguous, too focused on German suffering in a war Germany had started and prosecuted with terrible cruelty. Some viewers were moved. Others were disturbed. A few were angry that a German soldier's art was being exhibited in America when the war's wounds were still fresh and memories of American casualties were still painful. Morrison wrote that the painting had generated important conversations. About war and art. About how soldiers experience combat and captivity. About the human capacity to create meaning in meaningless circumstances. Whether people agreed with the painting's inclusion in the exhibition or not, they were thinking about questions that mattered. Weber considered this a success. Art that generated no reaction was decoration. Art that made people uncomfortable, that forced them to think about things they preferred to avoid, was fulfilling its highest purpose. But he knew that the painting in New York was only a recreation. The original remained in the bunker in the Hürtgen Forest, slowly deteriorating, probably unseen by anyone except occasional hikers who might stumble upon the abandoned fortification. In 1957, Weber made a private journey back to the forest. He was older now, 35 years old, married, working as a commercial artist in Stuttgart. The war had become history rather than immediate memory. Germany was rebuilding. The economic miracle was transforming cities from rubble into modern structures. People were looking forward rather than back. But Weber needed to see the bunker again. To understand whether the mural that had meant so much to 17 desperate men still existed or had finally been claimed by weather and neglect. Finding the bunker required effort. The forest had regrown significantly. Paths that had been clear in 1944 no longer existed. Fortifications were harder to locate among the trees and underbrush. But Weber remembered the landmarks, the orientation, the general area. After several hours of searching, he found Bunker 437. The structure showed significant deterioration. The entrance had collapsed further. Trees were growing from the damaged concrete. Water had penetrated the interior, creating pools and streams that ran down walls. The place smelled of mold and decay and the particular dampness of spaces where sunlight never reaches. Weber climbed inside carefully, using a flashlight to navigate the unstable interior. The bunker was dangerous now. Concrete chunks hung loosely from the ceiling. Floors were slick with moisture and algae. One section of the structure had partially collapsed, leaving a pile of broken concrete and twisted steel reinforcement bars blocking what had been the main corridor. He made his way to the chamber where the mural had been created. Water damage was severe. Large sections of the original drawing had been obliterated. The river existed only as a faint suggestion, barely visible through staining and erosion. The sky had disappeared entirely in some areas. The hills were fragmented, broken by cracks and spalling that had removed chunks of concrete along with the charcoal marks that had defined their shapes. But the mural was still recognizable. Someone looking at this wall could still see that it had once been a landscape. That soldiers had drawn hills and river and sky on concrete surfaces. That art had existed here in darkness and desperation. Weber photographed what remained. Not for any official purpose. Just for himself. To document that the mural had lasted 13 years, which was longer than anyone might have reasonably expected for charcoal and chalk and brick dust applied to concrete walls in an unheated, unprotected fortification. As he photographed, he noticed something new. More recent marks on the walls near the mural. Names and dates from the 1950s. Messages in German and English and what appeared to be French. Hikers who had found the bunker and left their own marks, their own proof that they had been here. But none of these later additions had touched the mural itself. The landscape remained unmarked except by weather. Whatever impulse made people want to leave their names on walls, something had prevented them from defacing the drawing. Some recognition that this was different. This was intentional. This was art, crude and damaged but still art, and deserved to be left alone. Weber found this profoundly moving. The mural had outlasted the war. It had survived long enough to be seen by people who had no connection to the soldiers who created it, no knowledge of what it had meant or why it existed. And those anonymous visitors had chosen, instinctively, to preserve rather than destroy. Before leaving, Weber added his own mark. Not on the mural. Never on the mural. But nearby, on an adjacent wall, he wrote with chalk, H. Weber, PFC, November 1944. We created beauty here because beauty was necessary. He dated it 1957 and left the bunker for what he knew would probably be the final time. The years that followed brought gradual recognition of Weber's work. His paintings of the bunker and prison camp were exhibited in various contexts. Museums of war history. Exhibitions on soldiers' art. Academic conferences on art and trauma. The work never became famous in conventional terms. But it found its audience among people who understood that war's reality was more complicated than glory or defeat, that soldiers' experiences included more than combat, that surviving required psychological strategies as well as physical endurance. Weber continued to work throughout his life. Commercial art paid the bills. Personal projects explored themes of memory and loss and the human capacity to create meaning in circumstances that seemed designed to eliminate all meaning. He taught occasionally at art schools, talking to younger generations who had no direct memory of war about what art could do when everything else failed. In 1982, a German historical preservation society contacted Weber about the bunker. They were documenting west wall fortifications before age and weather destroyed them completely. They had found Bunker 437 and identified the mural from Weber's descriptions and photographs. They wanted his permission to attempt to preserve what remained. Weber gave permission gladly. The preservation team stabilized the bunker's structure, prevented further collapse, and documented the mural extensively before attempting conservation. What could be preserved was preserved. What had been lost was recorded through photography and careful documentation. The bunker was eventually opened to the public as part of a historical site commemorating the Hürtgen Forest battle. Visitors could enter the stabilized structure, see the fragments of the mural that remained, read interpretive displays explaining what soldiers had created here and why it mattered. Weber visited one final time in 1985. He was 63 years old, his hands no longer steady enough for detailed work, his eyes requiring thick glasses to see clearly. He walked through the bunker slowly, accompanied by historians and preservation specialists who asked questions about the mural's creation, about the men who had contributed to it, about what it had felt like to draw landscapes on concrete walls while waiting for capture or death. He answered their questions as completely as memory allowed. Then he asked to be alone in the chamber where the mural had been created. The preservationists withdrew, leaving him with the fragments of landscape still visible on the restored walls. Weber stood in silence, looking at what remained of his first real work of art. The river was barely visible now, just a suggestion of flowing water preserved by chance in a section of concrete that had been protected from the worst weather damage. The hills existed as ghostly outlines, their forms implied rather than clearly defined. The sky was mostly gone, reclaimed by the gray concrete that had always been its medium. But it was still here. 41 years after he had drawn the first horizon line with a pencil stub, the mural still existed. Men he had served with, men who had contributed their memories to this composition, were mostly gone now. Sergeant Richter had died in 1979. Corporal Dietrich had passed away in 1983. Of the original 17 men who had served in Bunker 437, perhaps only 3 or 4 remained alive. But the mural remained. And people came to see it. To try to understand what it had meant to the men who created it. To think about art and survival and the human insistence on creating beauty even when beauty seemed impossible. Weber reached out and touched the concrete wall where the river had flowed. The surface was cold and rough beneath his fingers. Real. Physical. Proof that all of this had actually happened. That he had been here with 16 other men. That they had faced despair and chosen creation. That their choice had mattered, even if only to themselves. He spoke quietly, knowing no one could hear him. We survived. Some of us. Long enough to see this preserved. Long enough to know that what we did here mattered to someone besides ourselves. He thought about Private Stein, 17 years old, drawing houses on a bunker wall before dying in a prison camp hospital. About the millions of young men who had been consumed by this war, whose acts of courage or kindness or creation had been lost because no one documented them or preserved them or remembered them. The mural was an accident of preservation. Most art created by soldiers in desperate circumstances disappeared without record. Most acts of humanity in inhumane conditions left no trace. This one had survived by chance, by the particular thickness of concrete walls and the care of preservation specialists decades later. But it had survived. And that meant something. Not everything. Not enough to justify or redeem or make acceptable the suffering that had surrounded its creation. But something. A small proof that human beings, even in terrible circumstances, could choose beauty over despair. Could create rather than only destroy. Could insist on meaning when meaninglessness threatened to overwhelm everything. Weber left the bunker slowly, climbing back into sunlight that filtered through trees that had grown tall in the 40 years since the war's ending. The forest had healed. Not completely. Not perfectly. The landscape still bore scars. Metal fragments still lay beneath the forest floor. Craters still marked where artillery had struck. But life had returned. Trees had grown. Animals had come back. The forest that had been a battlefield had become wilderness again. The bunker would remain longer than the trees. Concrete resisted nature's healing more stubbornly than earth and wood. Centuries from now, perhaps, hikers would still find these fortifications. Would still see fragments of landscape drawn on walls. Would still wonder who had created them and why and what they meant. Weber hoped they would understand. Not completely. Complete understanding was impossible across the gulf of decades and changed circumstances. But partially. Enough to recognize that soldiers had been human beings. That they had suffered and feared and hoped. That they had created beauty because beauty was necessary. That they had chosen life, even when life seemed impossible. He returned to Stuttgart. To his studio. To his work. He lived another 8 years, continuing to create art, continuing to explore themes of memory and survival and the human capacity to find meaning in circumstances that seemed designed to eliminate all meaning. He died in 1993, 71 years old, his life spanning the terrible middle decades of the 20th century and extending just long enough to see the Cold War's end, the Berlin Wall's fall, the reunification of Germany. The bunker remained. The mural remained. Fragments of landscape drawn by desperate men, preserved by concrete and care, visible to anyone who wanted to make the journey into the Hürtgen Forest to see proof that humanity could persist even in circumstances designed to destroy it. The river still flowed, faint but present, drawn with charcoal by men who believed that beauty mattered even when everything else had failed. The skies still opened above hills that existed nowhere except on concrete walls. And light still broke through clouds on the horizon, suggesting dawn or dusk or both or neither. Suggesting change. Suggesting hope. Suggesting that the world continued beyond the darkness of bunkers and war and the grinding machinery of death. The mural existed. Men had created it. The creation had mattered to them. And decades later, it continued to matter to people who would never know the names of the 17 soldiers who had served in Bunker 437 in November 1944 but could understand, looking at crude drawings on concrete walls, that something important had happened here. That beauty had been necessary. That it remained necessary still. The soldier who painted hope on the walls of a bunker left that hope behind when he climbed out into American captivity. But the hope remained. Outlasting the war. Outlasting the men who created it. Outlasting certainty and despair and the terrible circumstances that had made its creation necessary. Hope remained. On concrete walls. In charcoal and chalk and brick dust. In the memory of 17 men who had chosen beauty when beauty seemed impossible. In the knowledge that even in humanity's darkest moments, human beings could still create rather than only destroy. Could still insist that life had meaning. Could still draw landscapes on bunker walls and believe, despite everything, that rivers would continue to flow and sky would continue to open and light would break through darkness as it always had and always would.